Hello, welcome to another how-to webinar from the TPS Southern Region. Today's episode is going to focus on finding charts and graphs as primary sources and maybe other kinds of visualizations of data. And so let's go ahead and get started by going to our screen. All right, so I'm going to start off at the Library of Congress website. And first of all, there's a really great resource. This is very easy to find and use at the teachers page. And there's a primary source set. But before we look at the primary source set, let's look at the analysis tools under Getting Started with Primary Sources, because there is one specifically made for this type of primary source. So here it is, Analyzing Charts and Graphs. And so I'm going to keep this open for a second because I want to come back to some of those questions. Now let's go to the Library of Congress website again and look for that primary source set. It's under Classroom Materials, Primary Source Sets, and it is also called Charts and Graphs. And it has a really great selection of different kinds of data visualizations from different eras in largely US history. And so, for instance, this first one is from I believe, the 1870 statistical analysis for the United States. This circular one is one that W.B. Du Bois put together for the Paris Exposition. A lot of these you can see come from newspaper articles, like, for instance, this one with this frightening title, Invitation to Live. It's from a 1948 newspaper in Montana, and it is depicting how far it takes for a car to stop in certain kinds of road conditions in winter weather, which would be very useful information for the public. So you can see the difference between wet versus dry concrete, tire chains versus no tire chains, natural rubber versus synthetic rubber, which I imagine tires are made of different kinds of things altogether today than they were 50 years ago. But this is still kind of interesting in terms of, looking at the immediate post-war period in the US and consumer patterns, and how we need to also have some safety rules to go along with that. And just a lot of really great kinds of charts and graphs that, because they might be part of larger books or atlases or newspapers, they're not individually included by themselves. So they won't come up necessarily if you search for them in the search results. You kind of have to sift through these other longer multi-part primary source documents that come up. And so that way, something like this, where somebody's already gone through and pulled these out for you, is just really invaluable. And then, of course, like every teacher's guide for primary source sets, they have background information and some suggestions, which is helpful for anybody who's doing research in the classroom or outside. There's the link to the analysis tool. There's also a link to those statistical atlases of the United States, of which there are 4 available. There's one from the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s, and 1970s, and I don't know why there's that gap there. But so I'm just going to kind of give you an idea of just the range of different kinds of visualizations for the data that come up. Of course, a lot of these are in map form because maps are a great way to visualize data, but they're also paired with certain kinds of weird bar charts and different color-coded types of things. Like this is looking at the populations of the most populous cities at that time across these different censuses from the 19th century. And so how cities have grown vis-a-vis each other in terms of size. And yeah, so this is a really great primary source set. But let's say you want to find something that's not included in one of the primary sources. Where else would you look? Well, one thing I want to show you is that under subject heading, there is a link for statistics. And so you can do a search for statistics in the Library of Congress website, and you come up with 3,500 hits that are available online. So you really want to use your search filters on the left-hand side to narrow that down. So let's say I just want to look at what's available as a photo, print, or drawing. And so, okay, yeah, that's a much more manageable number. So I'm interested in, let's say, this one from 1835, a family chart for the United States. A family chart. Okay, so what will families need to know? Let's say they were going to hang this on their wall. Now, I had to download this as a TIFF file so that I could zoom in. So let's take a look at that zoomed in right now. So, what would a family in 1835 want to know about the United States? So, here we have government, finances, mint, population, tonnage, canals, and railroads. And then, of course, there's a little sketch of every state and territory at that time and their population, square mileage, population per square mileage, and their capitals. And then you have this little summary of the executive government members and their salaries. So Andrew Jackson, who was president at that time, made $25,000, whereas his vice president, Martin Van Buren, made only $5,000. Okay, that's interesting. So this is kind of interesting in terms of which statistics do they think the American public actually wants or can make use of in 1835. So let's go back to, okay, the Library of Congress website. So let's say that you are looking at, for instance, one of these statistical atlases, and you want to find maybe some additional resources. If you scroll down, sometimes on the right-hand side, you see this shaded box that's called Featured In. And this will bring up all the blog articles across the Library of Congress's many different blogs that relate to this primary source, which is really great and really helps you in, save your time in searching. Also, for instance, this one right here is an exhibit, so it takes you to online exhibits as well. Here is a blog about teaching math. And so this is great for showing how these type of primary sources can be very interdisciplinary, not just about teaching history, of course, teaching math and statistics and government and other kinds of subjects. So that's some great ideas there. And what atlases can reveal about the Great Migration, a very important part of early 20th century US history. So this is another example of a very helpful, just very short article written in blog form that uses this type of primary source. So don't forget to look in this kind of featured in shaded box as well. Now, going back to this teacher's guide and analysis chart, one thing that a lot of people, when they're looking at charts, graphs, maps, and stuff, they think, well, data is facts, right? So if you're just depicting data, the facts speak for themselves. How can there be bias? Well, this is where you need to analyze them like you would any other kind of primary source and think, okay, so what's the purpose? Who made this? What choices did they make about things to include, and what choices did they make about things to not include? And how do they interpret the data? And so there's this really good example of a data set that could really benefit from this kind of analysis. And I found this when I was doing a teacher workshop and a lesson activity about this story about a devil baby that was born at Jane Addams' Hull House. So for context, Jane Addams was a progressive era reformer who had this building in Chicago in the early 20th century called Hull House, where a lot of recently immigrated women were housed before they could support themselves. And so they tended to be very poor and uneducated. And so this type of story really kind of blew up at a place like that. So, to kind of set the context for what life was like for these immigrant women, I used this immigration figures for 1903. And so, the first thing to notice about this source is that it was created by the Immigration Restriction League. So, right away, you know that their whole purpose is to restrict immigration, or at least immigration from certain parts of the world. And so they're looking at the how much immigration has increased over the recent years, how much immigration of illiterate people has increased, and how much immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe has increased as opposed to Northern and Western Europe. And then they have their little explanatory notes talking about how some of these are based on, immigrants themselves were allowed to report whether or not they were illiterate. So, of course, maybe you can't believe all of them because they're going to want to say that they are literate. But then it has under general remarks where they're really saying things like, generally undesirable because they're unintelligent, of low vitality, of poor physique, able to perform only the cheapest kind of manual labor. And basically, they don't think that certain types of immigrants are going to make certain, good citizens. And so they're using this data to kind of back up their points. And so you really have to make sure that you analyze it so you can see what their real agenda is. So here's the illiteracy rates. First of all, from Western Europe. And it's kind of interesting. They divide Italy here into Northern Italy versus Southern Italy, because Northern Italy is traditionally more educated and wealthier than Southern Italy, and that also bears out in their literacy rates here. So, I mean, nowadays these immigrant populations are very, they're Americans, but 100 years ago they were deemed probably not fit by a lot of people to be proper citizens. And so that's just an example of why using the analysis tools are a really great way to really get at kind of charts and graphs and other kinds of data visualizations. Now, another great resource to use when you're trying to find these types of primary sources and use them, there are some research guides that have great statistic resources on them. So one is the US Census Connections. This is the one I probably recommend the most because it's like your doorway into all the different censuses taken for the US and where to find them. You don't have to have a subscription to Ancestry.com to access these things. Excuse me, because these will take you to the census records from the Census Bureau. So you can just click on those links and get to those records and download them as PDFs. But not just of population, there's also censuses of business activities and special censuses for agriculture and government. And then, write up about the history of the US Census and why it's important. So that's a good research guide. There are a number of other research guides. If you go to the research guide homepage and you search by the word statistics, you'll get a really good list that will come up, including doing consumer research, which I thought was really interesting. There's one on tourism and travel. There's this one on US election statistics. If you're doing world history, there's an international census data sources one. There's also a research guide about data sets, and that's to go along with this digital collection on selected data sets from the Library of Congress. And so you can get to that research guide from this digital collection homepage and vice versa by just clicking there. So that is a really quick overview of where you can find some of these types of sources, and they're very valuable for providing different kinds of perspectives and information when you're looking at any subject and for making that kind of more interdisciplinary. So thank you for watching, and tune in next time.